Welcome to today's deep dive, where we're going to be looking at something that I think is on a lot of people's minds these days. How is all of this digital technology affecting our brains? You've given us some really interesting sources to work with. We've got Nicholas Carr's book, The Shallows. There's some research on brain plasticity, and even some insights on how our reading habits are changing in the digital age. So a lot to dig into today.
Yeah, it really is. It's almost like we're trying to understand the connection between the internet and how we think. Are we really becoming, shallower thinkers? Or is the internet just another tool that we have to learn to use well?
Well, one of the things that really stood out to me in these sources is this whole idea of brain plasticity. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Right. So brain plasticity basically means our brains are constantly rewiring themselves based on what we experience. So it's not like our brains are just fixed from birth. They're always adapting to what we do and how we think. Michael Marcinek, who's like a leading neuroscientist in this field, he showed just how much our brains can actually change throughout our lives.
So you're saying it's not just kids who can learn new things, and develop new skills. Even as adults, our brains can still change a lot.
Oh, absolutely. And it comes down to this idea, neurons that fire together wire together, as neuroscientist Donald Hebb put it. So every time we do something new or we repeat a certain thought pattern, we're actually strengthening specific connections in our brain. And that's how we learn new things and develop habits, both good and bad ones.
It makes me think about, how much time we all spend online, scrolling through social media, browsing the web, all of that digital activity. Could that actually be physically changing our brains?
Now that's the big question. And it's something that Nicholas Carr really digs into in The Shallows. He argues that any intellectual technology, whether it's maps or clocks or even the internet, shapes how we think in a big way.
Yeah, and he actually uses the example of maps and how they made us better at navigating the world. But at the same time, maybe they weakened our natural sense of direction, like we traded one cognitive skill for another.
That's a perfect example. And it really leads to the question of what mental skills are we gaining or losing in this digital age? Remember that story Carr tells about Nathaniel Hawthorne, where he was trying to have this peaceful moment of thinking and then a train goes by and completely shatters it. It's almost like a metaphor for how technology can interrupt our focus and make it difficult to really think deeply. Have you ever felt that kind of intrusion in your own life?
Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
It's like every notification, every email, every ping on my phone is like a little train just completely derailing my concentration.
Yeah. Exactly. And that takes us to another important point, the difference between how the printed book and the internet shape our thinking. So for centuries, the book, right, it was like the way to share knowledge and ideas. And reading a book, it really requires you to pay attention, follow an argument, and think deeply.
Yeah, it almost feels like a lost art these days.
Yeah.
In this world of you know, bite-sized content and constant distractions. I know I find it so much harder to just sit down and focus on a book.
You're definitely not alone.
Mhm.
Carr argues that the internet, with all its hyperlinks and distractions, it kind of pushes us to skim and scan instead of really reading deeply. Instead of diving into one text, we're jumping around from link to link, constantly bombarded with new information.
Right, and there was that study mentioned in the sources about how hyperlinks can actually make it harder to understand what you're reading. And, how we tend to read online content in like an F pattern, focusing on the top and left side of the page and barely skimming the rest. Maybe we should be more intentional about how we read things online, like consciously using a pointer or taking notes or something to stay focused. What do you think about that?
Those are great strategies. Anything that makes us be more active and engaged when we're reading can help us resist that urge to skim. It's about training ourselves to slow down, to not just jump around, but to really absorb the information.
It's almost like we need to develop new mental habits for this digital age.
Yeah.
What about our memory, though? It seems like we rely more and more on the internet as a kind of like external brain, right?
Right. That's the idea Clive Thompson explores. He calls it the internet as an outboard brain. We're so used to just Googling everything that we don't even try to remember things anymore.
And it is super convenient to have all that information right there at our fingertips.
Right.
But I do wonder what it means in the long run. Is it possible that by outsourcing our memory like this, we're actually making it weaker?
It's a real concern that a lot of researchers have. The worry is that by relying too much on external memory aids, it might mess with our ability to develop strong conceptual schemas, those mental frameworks that help us organize and make sense of the world.
So we might be getting tons of information, but losing the ability to really understand it and connect the dots.
Exactly. And that brings us back to brain plasticity. Yes, our brains are adapting to our digital habits, But the good news is we can also choose to do things that strengthen our mental abilities.
So what can we actually do? Should we all just ditch our smartphones and like completely disconnect from the internet?
Well, for some people, maybe, but that's not really realistic for most of us. But we can be more mindful of how we use technology. Nicholas Carr talks about his experience of actually dismantling his online life to regain focus and control. He quit social media, cut back on email, and even got rid of his smartphone for a while. Now, that might sound extreme, but I think the point is to set boundaries.
So instead of letting the internet run our lives, we need to be more intentional about when and how we engage with it.
Exactly. It's about taking back control of our time and attention, and setting aside time for things we can do offline, especially things that require deep thought and concentration.
So like reading an actual physical book.
Exactly. When you read a book without all those distractions, your mind can really focus on the words. It strengthens those pathways in your brain that help you read deeply and understand what you're reading.
You know, I've noticed that too. It's so much easier to get lost in a book when I'm away from my computer or my phone. So like I can finally quiet all the noise in my head and focus on the story.
That's a great point. And it highlights another important strategy, minimizing distractions. Our devices are constantly vying for our attention. It takes real effort to resist checking our notifications or browsing the web every few minutes.
I've tried things like turning off notifications and leaving my phone in another room when I need to focus. It definitely helps, but it's a constant battle.
It is a battle, but it's a battle worth fighting. Every time you resist a distraction, you're actually making yourself better at focusing and controlling your attention. It's like working out a muscle in your brain.
Yeah, it's almost like we need to be as strategic with our technology use as we are with our finances or our diets.
That's a really good analogy, actually. Just like we make choices about, what we eat and how we spend our money, we have to be just as intentional about how we use and interact with information in this digital world.
So besides, minimizing distractions and making time for deep reading, what are some other things we can do to strengthen those cognitive muscles?
One of the most powerful tools we have is writing. When you write, you have to organize your thoughts. You build an argument, and it really makes you think hard. It's a fantastic way to sharpen your critical thinking skills and really get a deeper understanding of complex topics.
I've noticed that too. When I take the time to actually write about something I've read or learned, I remember it so much better. It's like writing it down helps to solidify the information in my brain.
That's because when you're writing, you're using multiple parts of your brain. You're not just passively taking in information, you're actively processing it, making connections and expressing it in your own way. That deeper level of engagement leads to much better learning and memory.
And it doesn't have to be formal writing, right?
Yeah,
Even just jotting down notes or thoughts in a journal can be helpful.
absolutely. Any kind of writing that makes you think critically and express yourself can be beneficial. The key is to make it a regular habit.
So to sum it all up, we've learned that while the internet has brought a lot of good things, it also comes with some challenges to how our brains work. It can break our attention, make us read superficially, and even weaken our memories.
Yeah, but the good news is we're not helpless against these challenges. If we understand how the internet affects our brains, we can make smarter choices about how we use technology, and we can develop strategies to keep thinking deeply and stay in control of our minds.
So it's about setting boundaries, minimizing distractions, and doing things that promote deep thinking, like reading, writing, and even just having face-to-face conversations.
Exactly. Those are all great strategies. And I think the most important takeaway is that our brains are incredibly adaptable.
Yeah.
With a little effort and practice, we can strengthen those neural pathways that are responsible for focus, attention, and deep thought.
I like this, a very empowering message. We're not just victims of technology. We have the power to shape our own minds. Before we go, is there anything else you want to leave our listeners with?
Yes, actually, I want to share this quote from Nicholas Carr's book. He writes, "The connecting is the thinking, the connecting is the self." It really makes you think about how much our thoughts and even our identities are becoming intertwined with the structure of the internet.
It does make you wonder, are we shaping the internet or is it shaping us? I think that's something worth thinking about as we move forward in this digital age. And to our listener, I hope you keep exploring these ideas and experimenting with ways to take control of your own mental experience in the digital world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.